And now on Channel 5, a BBC hour.
Shanghai, May 1989. The Chinese leaders had promised their grateful people a more liberal future. Mad with excitement, the locals did their wake-up exercises and concentrated on the eternal questions which have haunted Chinese philosophers throughout the ages. Who is that Western interloper? What does he want from us? How did he get in? I got in on the daily jumbo shuttle service from Hong Kong. Only an hour away, but in another world. Hong Kong was part of the West. Shanghai was in China. In Hong Kong, there were 5 million people jammed into one city. In Shanghai, there were that many people at the airport, waiting for relatives visiting from the outside world to bring them TV sets. But the government was very definite that prosperity was on the way. China would soon be producing scads of consumer goods just like the West. Every family in the country would have a cordless telephone on which to order a takeaway Chinese meal. Unlimited wealth would be created, and 1,000 million people would be rolling in it. For the moment, foreign currency was still the best kind of money to have. For a pitifully small amount of it, you could catch a cab to town, or wherever the cab stopped when the engine fell out. My own cab ran quite well if you didn't mind a tendency to catch fire in second gear. The steering wheel had only a spiritual connection with the car. It didn't matter because there were hardly any other cars to hit. But there were almost as many bicycles as people, and enough Western-style hotels were being built for everyone in the West to come here at once. I made my base in the Shanghai Hilton, where a standard of personal service was immediately on view, which Mao Zedong would have condemned as slavery. From high up in the Hilton, I could do what Westerners in Shanghai spent 100 years doing. I could look down on the Chinese. Up where I was, there was splendid isolation. There was very little of that down there. With the eye of a trained sociologist, I could tell at a glance that most of the people in the area had only limited acquaintance with 24-hour room service. If they really were heading for the future, they were starting from a long way in the past. Shanghai is the biggest seaport in China, but it's not on the sea. It's on a river, the Huangpu, and along the bank of the Huangpu looms the biggest deal in Shanghai. Known to the Shanghainese as the Waitan, but to the world by its German name, the Bund, it dates from the time when the Western powers had the best land in the city divided up into concessions, from which they drew enormous profits, while the Chinese ate scraps. Shanghai became the most famous Western city in the East. When I was growing up, every Hollywood film about China featured a big scene set on the Bund, with Sydney Greenstreet and other Western actors almost as large being towed along in rickshaws by very small extras of Oriental origin wearing comical conical hats. It was a fantasy. But the really amazing thing about the fantasy was that the reality it was based on was still there, looking just like a film set. What the war hadn't destroyed, the revolution had preserved, wrapped in dust, a permanent reminder of colonialism at its most shameless. The Chinese had counted for nothing in their own city, a message which the occupying Japanese army backed up with bayonets. After the war, the revolution ensured that Shanghai would belong to the Chinese people. Lots of Chinese people. 12 million people, all voting communist. They all set out on a 40-year-long march to transform a society whose wealth was only for the few into a society whose poverty was shared by all. Some of them seemed to be taking the marching thing a bit literally. I was only in town to make a documentary and hadn't expected anything so spectacular as a demonstration. Later I heard that they were students who thought that the new freedom to get rich should logically entail a few other freedoms as well, such as the freedom to stage a procession without being thrown in jail. It looked as if the party chairman, Deng Xiaoping, agreed with them, since nobody had turned up to throw them in jail yet. Personal liberty, hologram credit cards, Arnold Schwarzenegger videos, it was all just a step away. At Shanghai's #1 department store, called Shanghai's #1 department store, the front window was full of desirable objects. Inside the shop, it turned out they were not available. They would be soon. It was a quiet part of the day, so there were only about 500,000 people present. They were doing a lot more looking than buying. Instead of things that people wanted at a price they could afford, there were a few things they wanted at prices they couldn't afford, and a lot of things they didn't want at prices they couldn't afford either. But a country with a centrally planned economy can provide ordinary people with access to goods which in the West are available only to an elite. There was a plentiful supply of navigational equipment for submarines. Now any ordinary Chinese citizen who owned an ocean-going submarine wouldn't have to worry about running it aground just for want of a simple electronic echo sounder. After nightfall, it was almost dark, but not quite. There was just enough neon to hint at the vivid economic future. Young Chinese foreign exchange experts offered to take the few pounds sterling in my wallet and convert it into a steamer trunk full of the local dough. I admired their energy, but declined the deal, because the evidence suggested that there wouldn't be much to buy with the cash except navigational equipment for my submarine.